Soldiers in Israel are throwing pills on the table, and in Africa, one captain is throwing millions on the table. While Western armies drown in antidepressants and despair, Burkina Faso's Ibrahim Traoré has just signed a $164 million medical deal. And here's the shock. This isn't charity, it's strategy. Because medicine isn't just about health, it's about sovereignty, morale, and survival. So let me ask you right now, where are you watching from, and how does your country treat its soldiers? Do veterans get real care, or do they get pills, promises, and nothing more? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this is not just Africa's story, this is a global story. And by the way, if you're new here, this is Africa Daily. Good news, a channel bringing you stories from the heart of Africa, with the courage to say what others won't. We're building a community across America, Africa, and Europe. So hit subscribe, join the conversation, and stay connected. Now, let's break it down. Because behind this $164 million deal, there's more than medicine. There's a message the world can't ignore. Soldiers in some countries are collapsing under the weight of pills. But in Burkina Faso, the story begins with a very different scene. In Israel, troops walk into parliament and dump bottles of antidepressants on the table. In the United States, studies show that more veterans take their own lives each year than die on active battlefields. And yet, in West Africa, Captain Ibrahim Traoré is announcing a medical deal worth $164 million. That contrast alone tells you the world is split between armies drowning in medication and one army trying to build an entire system of care. And if you think that's a small detail, look closer. Behind every statistic is a person. Think of a young soldier, barely 20, sent home with scars you can't see. In most places, he's given a prescription and told to cope. But imagine if that same soldier walked into a local military hospital, saw doctors who understood his trauma, and realized he wasn't forgotten. The difference between those two paths is the difference between despair and resilience. Most Americans know the story of a relative who served, came back changed, and found the system unprepared. According to research from the VA, a majority of veterans feel the government does not meet their mental health needs. People, if given the choice, would always prefer real support over another pill bottle. And that is exactly why Traoré's decision carries symbolic weight. It signals to soldiers that the state sees them not as disposable, but as the backbone of sovereignty. However, there's another layer. For decades, Africa has been portrayed as dependent on foreign aid for even the most basic medical supplies. By shifting millions into domestic healthcare, Traoré isn't just treating soldiers, he's making a statement. It's a move that says, our survival won't be prescribed by outsiders. That is a subtle but powerful twist, because medicine here doubles as a political weapon. So the question becomes, will this investment transform daily life for soldiers, or will it end up as another headline lost in the noise? That uncertainty hangs in the air, and it's the tension that sets the stage for what comes next, because money on paper is only the beginning, and the real story starts once the deal touches the ground. $164 million is not a random number, it is a line in the sand. While most countries wait for outside donors to tell them what's possible, Burkina Faso is writing its own prescription. The deal Traoré has pushed forward channels money into three areas: new military hospitals in Ouagadougou, rehabilitation centers for wounded and traumatized soldiers, and research programs aimed at producing African medicine instead of importing expensive foreign pills. The figure itself is bold enough to raise eyebrows in Washington and Paris, but the design is what really matters. This is an attempt to build an ecosystem rather than patch holes. And here's where it gets intriguing. For years, African armies have operated with second-hand equipment and outsourced health services. Suddenly, Traoré is promising local clinics, staffed by African doctors, serving African troops. That shift is not just logistical, it's psychological. A soldier who sees his government investing in his recovery feels he belongs to something larger than the battlefield. Compare that with the average U.S. veteran who returns home to long waiting lines at the VA, or with Israeli reservists whose trauma is managed with pills instead of policy. The contrast itself becomes a story. There is also the human element hidden in the numbers. Think of a medic in the Burkina Faso army who has spent years working with limited tools, forced to send his patients abroad when treatment was too complex. Under this deal, he can walk into a new facility, hold the equipment in his own hands, and know that his patients will not be abandoned. Most people, if given that kind of change, would feel a pride that cannot be measured in dollars. And according to studies on workplace psychology, when people believe their institution invests in them, performance rises across the board. Of course, not everyone sees it the same way. Some critics whisper that 164 million could vanish into corruption or simply stall in bureaucracy. Others argue it's a stunt designed to win headlines and silence unrest in the barracks. But the twist is that even if critics are right, the symbolism remains powerful. Soldiers and civilians alike are watching a leader who is willing to risk political capital on healthcare. A choice most leaders avoid because hospitals don't make quick headlines the way military parades do. So you have to ask yourself, is this the moment Africa begins to build its own system of care, or just another experiment waiting to collapse under pressure? That tension between promise and delivery is what gives the story its weight. And it sets the stage for the next question. How will the people closest to Traoré, the soldiers themselves, respond when they see bricks rising and clinics opening before their eyes? A deal is just numbers on paper until it touches real lives, and that's where the story cuts deepest. Imagine a soldier named Musa, 24 years old, who returned from the Northern Front with injuries invisible to the eye. At first, he was restless, unable to sleep, unable to speak about what he had seen. His commanders handed him painkillers, nothing more. In the old system, Musa's future would have been swallowed by silence. But under Traoré's plan, Musa walks into a rehabilitation center, not a pharmacy counter. He meets doctors who understand post-trauma, and he begins to rebuild not only his body, but also his place in society. And that shift carries weight beyond one man. In countries where soldiers return broken and unsupported, families often collapse under the strain. According to surveys in the United States, the majority of veterans' spouses report feeling abandoned by the system, forced to carry the emotional load alone. Human beings, if given the chance, adapt quickly to support networks, but when those networks fail, even the strongest household cracks. Traoré's investment flips that equation. The state becomes the safety net, not just the family. The paradox here is striking. In wealthier nations, billions are spent on advanced weapons, yet pennies are invested in repairing the people who use them. Burkina Faso, with far fewer resources, is trying the opposite, channeling millions into care before expanding arsenals. That inversion is a story in itself, and it unsettles those who believe power only comes from firepower. And there's another layer. When a soldier like Musa feels the state stands behind him, his identity changes. He is no longer just a uniform sent to the front. He becomes part of a national project, part of a promise that his sacrifice is not disposable. For most people, the difference between being seen and being ignored is the difference between loyalty and disillusion. Maybe that's why, according to behavioral research, employees in any sector who feel valued are twice as likely to stay committed even under stress. If that holds true for office workers, imagine the effect on a soldier whose life depends on trust. So the human story reinforces the political one. Every clinic built is not just a wall of bricks, but a wall of confidence. And as more soldiers begin to feel that transformation, the ripple spreads from the barracks into the streets, shaping how society views its own defenders. That mood of shifting perception is what leads us to the wider question: how will the region around Burkina Faso interpret this new model of care? Praise in one capital often sounds like provocation in another. As soon as the $164 million medical deal was announced, neighbors across West Africa reacted in two very different voices. In Bamako and Niamey, leaders of Mali and Niger stood side by side with Traoré, applauding the move as a model for the AES alliance. They argued that an army cared for at home is an army that cannot be manipulated from abroad. That sentiment, however, landed badly in Abuja and Accra, where ECOWAS officials muttered that the deal looked less like healthcare and more like politics dressed in medical robes. And that split matters, because regional blocs thrive on unity, yet fracture easily over symbols. For AES members, this investment represents sovereignty stitched into every hospital bed. For ECOWAS skeptics, it feels like a warning shot, a reminder that their authority is being tested by a younger generation of leaders. The mini twist is that what begins as a medical contract quickly becomes a referendum on who gets to define the future of West Africa. There's also the human dimension playing out in quiet conversations across the region. A soldier in Niger hears that Burkina Faso is building new clinics and wonders why his government still relies on foreign NGOs. A family in Ghana reads the headlines and asks why billions are borrowed for highways but not for veterans' hospitals. Most people, when they see a neighbor improve, naturally compare their own conditions. According to social research, human beings are wired to measure fairness by looking sideways, not just upward. That comparison fuels both pride and envy, and in politics, it often fuels change. Think of a short story unfolding on the border. A Burkina Faso soldier visiting family in Côte d'Ivoire tells his cousin about the new rehabilitation center opening near Ouagadougou. The cousin, also a serviceman, shakes his head and says their own barracks clinic hasn't been renovated in 20 years. In that moment, pride turns into pressure. One leader's choice has quietly placed a burden on others. So the paradox is clear. Traoré's medical deal strengthens bonds with some neighbors while straining ties with others. It becomes both a unifier and a divider, a symbol of sovereignty and a spark of rivalry. And that tension naturally leads to the bigger stage, because once a regional ripple begins, the international players are never far behind. A hospital in Ouagadougou might look like bricks and mortar, but in Paris it looks like a warning. The same project that earns applause in Mali sets off alarms in Europe. French analysts quietly argue that if Burkina Faso can finance and run its own medical network for soldiers, then foreign aid loses its leverage. Washington reads the numbers differently. $164 million is not just healthcare. It could be the footprint of Chinese capital or Russian advisors. And in Moscow and Ankara, the tone is unmistakable. This is opportunity dressed as medicine. The irony is sharp. Western capitals, with far larger budgets, spend billions on weapons contracts while struggling to explain why veteran suicides keep climbing. Yet when a smaller African state directs millions toward hospitals, they call it destabilizing. That contradiction reveals the deeper twist. In global politics, care itself becomes a threat. A soldier treated at home is one less soldier dependent on foreign charity, and that shift rattles those who build influence on dependency. But the debate isn't just geopolitical. It filters into daily conversations. In America, veterans watching the story online might quietly ask why Burkina Faso is investing in rehab centers while their own communities face shortages at the VA. People, if given the comparison, instinctively measure their own government's priorities. And according to surveys of U.S. public opinion, most citizens believe the system spends more on wars abroad than on care at home. The Burkina Faso announcement presses on that wound, even from half a world away. There is also the human paradox in how power is perceived. To a French diplomat, Traoré's medical deal reads like defiance. To a Burkina Faso soldier, it reads like dignity. Those two interpretations exist at the same moment, and whichever one dominates will shape the narrative. Short stories surface in newsrooms. A European official complains that sovereignty is being weaponized, while a Burkina Faso nurse describes the relief of finally having modern equipment. The same sentence, "a new clinic opened," carries opposite meanings depending on where you stand. And that's why this deal, though framed as medicine, is already being debated as strategy. It is not just about treating wounds. It is about reshaping alliances. The mood in Ouagadougou is hopeful, but the mood in Paris is anxious. And as hope collides with anxiety, the story naturally shifts to the longer horizon. What this means not only for soldiers today, but for the very fabric of society in the years to come. An army's strength is not measured only by the size of its arsenal, but by the state of its people. That is the paradox most governments overlook. They invest in drones, tanks, and air defense systems, while their soldiers quietly struggle with untreated trauma. Traoré's medical deal flips that order on its head. By putting money into soldiers' bodies and minds, he is gambling that morale can be as decisive as firepower. And the numbers back up that wager. According to studies on workforce performance, when people believe their institution invests in them, productivity rises by nearly 50%. If that logic holds for office jobs, then imagine its effect on soldiers who live with the daily pressure of combat. A fighter who knows his recovery is guaranteed fights differently from one who believes he will be discarded the moment he breaks. That kind of psychological security does not just save lives, it shapes national stability. The change also has ripple effects in society. In many countries, veterans' families are left to carry the weight when the state withdraws. That pattern often fuels disillusionment. Spouses overworked, children growing up resentful, communities quietly fractured. But when the state steps in, building clinics, hiring doctors, and offering counseling, the pressure is redistributed. After that, families breathe easier, and the soldier is no longer a burden but a respected figure. Most Americans know at least one neighbor who has wrestled with the VA system. They know how bitter that fight can be. So, the idea of a government choosing prevention over neglect is bound to strike a chord across audiences. There's also a hidden twist. A healthier military does not just defend borders, it defends legitimacy. A soldier who feels seen becomes less likely to join mutinies or plot coups. History shows that armies ignored by their own governments often become governments themselves. By spending $164 million now, Traoré may be paying the insurance premium against future unrest. That is a calculation as political as it is medical. Picture one example. A Burkina Faso officer recalls his father, who served in the 1990s and returned home injured, left to fend for himself. Now, that same officer watches a clinic rise near his barracks. The before and after is more than generational, it is structural. And when he tells that story at the dinner table, it becomes part of how society remembers who cared and who did not. So the deal, while presented as healthcare, carries the weight of nation building. It suggests that the measure of sovereignty is not only the flag on the border, but the hospital in the capital. And as soldiers begin to internalize that message, the focus inevitably shifts to the harder question: whether a promise this large can survive the obstacles waiting in the shadows. Every bold promise casts a shadow, and this deal is no exception. $164 million looks impressive on paper, but the question that lingers is whether Burkina Faso can truly deliver. In a country where budgets are often stretched thin, even a small diversion of funds could drain the momentum. Corruption is not unique to Africa, it is universal. Americans know the feeling when tax dollars vanish into projects that never materialize. The paradox is that the bigger the project, the more tempting the leak. And the risk doesn't end with money. Building clinics is one thing, staffing them is another. Doctors and nurses are already in short supply across West Africa. If the government cannot train or retain enough professionals, the buildings may stand empty, symbols of ambition without capacity. People, if given new walls but no real service, quickly lose faith. According to surveys in the United States, trust in institutions falls fastest when expectations are raised and then betrayed. The same human reaction applies here. Hope becomes disappointment, and disappointment turns into anger. There is also the danger of political backlash. Rivals inside and outside the country may frame the deal as reckless spending or foreign-influenced policy. They may ask why hundreds of millions go to soldiers while civilians wait for basic clinics. That line of criticism could erode support if not managed carefully. The twist within the twist is that a project designed to strengthen sovereignty could be spun as favoritism, feeding the very divisions it was meant to heal. Short stories are already whispered in marketplaces. A contractor claims he hasn't been paid. A nurse wonders if promises of new equipment will ever be met. A family fears the project will stall halfway. Each of these voices may sound small, but together they shape perception. Most people, when they hear repeated doubts, internalize them long before they see results. And yet, even with all these risks, the potential remains enormous. If the deal stumbles, it could fuel cynicism. If it succeeds, it could rewrite what African leadership looks like in the 21st century. That knife-edge tension is what gives this moment its urgency, and it leads directly to the broader perspective. The meaning of this medical gamble not just for Burkina Faso, but for the continent as a whole. A medical deal may look like policy, but in truth it is a mirror of identity. When a government spends $164 million on hospitals for its soldiers, it is saying something far larger than we care about health. It is saying, we will not wait for outsiders to decide who lives and who breaks. That statement, in a world where many nations outsource their survival, is revolutionary. And here's the striking contrast. In wealthier societies, people often assume progress means more technology, more weapons, more contracts signed behind closed doors. In Burkina Faso, progress is being redefined as a hospital bed where none existed before. The paradox is that what seems ordinary to some feels extraordinary to others. Most Americans would not think twice about driving past a VA center, even if they complain about its inefficiencies. But for a Burkinabe soldier, walking into a new clinic for the first time is like stepping into proof that his country values his life. The twist is that such gestures echo far beyond the barracks. When families see soldiers treated with dignity, they begin to expect the same for civilians. That expectation can become the seed of wider reforms. And according to social behavior research, once people have seen a better standard, they rarely accept going back. If human beings can imagine an improvement, they begin to demand it. That is how small investments can shift entire cultures. Think of a mother in Ouagadougou whose husband served 20 years ago and came home untreated, compared to her son, who now returns from deployment to a modern rehabilitation center. She carries two memories in the same household, one of abandonment, one of recognition. That before and after comparison becomes a family story, and family stories shape national memory. So the deal is more than a budget line. It is a marker of what Africa could become if leadership insists on building instead of begging. It shows that sovereignty is not an abstract slogan, but a lived experience, visible in walls, beds, and the quiet relief of families who know their soldiers will not be left behind. And as that reality settles in, the focus naturally turns from one country's gamble to the continent's horizon, because what begins in Burkina Faso rarely stays there for long. So here's where it all lands. While soldiers in other parts of the world are tossing pills in protest, Burkina Faso under Ibrahim Traoré is tossing millions into a new future. A future where sovereignty isn't just a speech, it's a hospital bed, where loyalty isn't forced, it's earned. And where the true strength of an army is measured not only by its weapons but by the well-being of its people. And this is why the $164 million medical deal matters. It isn't only about medicine, it's about rewriting the social contract. If soldiers feel cared for, nations feel stable. If nations feel stable, alliances shift. And if alliances shift, the balance of power no longer belongs to those who assumed Africa would always depend on them. That is the real story hidden behind the headlines. Now we want to hear from you. Where are you watching from, and how does your country treat its soldiers or veterans? Do they get real care, or do they get empty promises? Share your experience in the comments. We read them all, and your voice is what keeps this conversation alive. And if you believe Africa's story deserves to be heard, then subscribe to Africa Daily Good News. Like this video, share it with friends, and stay connected, because this community is built on your support. Together, we're making sure the narrative is not dictated by the old powers but told by the people living it. And when you're ready for the next chapter, join us in our upcoming report. Another bold African move is on the horizon, and trust me, you won't want to miss it.